Since December of 2023, Iceland's Reykjanes Peninsula has erupted 9 separate times along the same crater row, a pattern so consistent that Icelandic authorities, tour operators, and residents of the town of Grindavik had all, in a strange way, settled into a rhythm with it. An eruption would come. It would last anywhere from a single day to nearly 2 months. It would end. Magma would begin reaccumulating beneath the Svartsengi region, and within weeks, or a few months, it would happen again. That rhythm has now broken. Since the most recent eruption ended in early August of 2025, Iceland has gone through its longest pause of the entire cycle, and beneath the surface, something measurably different is building. The volume of magma accumulating beneath Svartsengi has now exceeded every previous interval since this eruptive period began, climbing past 26, then 27 million cubic meters, more than has ever built up between eruptions in this specific volcanic cycle. Scientists studying the system have noted something else, too, that it now appears to be taking a larger volume of accumulated magma to actually trigger an eruption than it did earlier in the sequence, a genuine shift in the mechanics of how this system behaves. Today, we're breaking down exactly what has changed at Reykjanes, why a longer, larger pause is not simply good news, and what volcanologists studying this system believe it could mean for the years and possibly decades ahead. Drop a comment right now. If you visited Iceland during this eruption cycle, or you're planning a trip and wondering what this means for you, tell me. And if you want the moment this changes, subscribe right now. It's free. A thumbs up helps enormously. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so the people who need to see it actually do. Now let's get into it. The eruption cycle that started after 800 years of silence. To understand why this pause matters, you need the full arc of what's been happening on the Reykjanes Peninsula since 2021. Before that year, this stretch of southwest Iceland had not produced a volcanic eruption in roughly 800 years. Then, in March 2021, a fissure opened at Fagradalsfjall, and the peninsula's centuries of quiet ended. 3 eruptions followed at Fagradalsfjall between 2021 and 2023. Spectacular but largely harmless events in a remote area that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors to watch glowing lava up close. Then, in December 2023, the activity shifted to a new location, the Sundhnúkur crater row, just north of the fishing town of Grindavik, and the character of the eruptions changed with it. This series has been far more consequential. The very first eruption in this new phase was preceded by an earthquake swarm so intense, roughly 20,000 tremors, the strongest reaching magnitude 5.3, that Grindavik had to be evacuated before the eruption even began. Ground subsidence damaged homes and infrastructure across the town so severely that Grindavik has remained largely off-limits ever since. Since that first eruption, 9 more have followed along the same crater system, some lasting only a day, one stretching 54 days, the longest in the series. Lava has repeatedly crossed roads, cut power lines, breached protective barriers, and forced the repeated closure of the Blue Lagoon, one of Iceland's most visited tourist destinations, which sits directly adjacent to the eruption site. What's different about the current pause, every previous gap between eruptions in this series followed a roughly similar pattern. Magma would drain from the reservoir beneath Svartsengi during an eruption, then begin reaccumulating, and within a matter of weeks to a few months, enough pressure would build to trigger the next event. The interval that began after the most recent eruption ended has not followed that pattern. As the pause extended past 200 days, then well past 300, the Icelandic Meteorological Office noted that if the ongoing uplift trend continued, the total volume of accumulated magma could exceed anything recorded between previous eruptions in the entire sequence. That is exactly what happened. Measurements have tracked the accumulated volume climbing past 26 million cubic meters, then past 27 million, officially the largest buildup measured between eruptions since this volcanic cycle began in late 2023. This is not simply a longer wait for the same eventual outcome. Volcanologists monitoring the system have specifically flagged a shift in what it now appears to take to trigger an eruption. Earlier in the series, eruptions followed relatively modest volumes of reaccumulated magma. Now, it appears that larger volumes are required before the system actually breaches and produces a new eruption, a genuine change in the underlying mechanics of the Svartsengi Sundhnúkur system, rather than simply a random gap in an otherwise unchanged pattern. Why a bigger, slower buildup is not automatically reassuring. It would be easy to read the volcano paused longer than usual as good news, a sign the system might be running out of steam. Volcanologists studying Reykjanes are not interpreting it that way, and the reasoning matters. A larger accumulated volume of magma sitting in the reservoir beneath Svartsengi represents more stored pressure and more available material than any single event in this series has released before. Whenever the system does eventually breach again, whether through a new fissure eruption or a magma intrusion that doesn't reach the surface at all, it will be releasing pressure from a larger, more pressurized reservoir than any of the 9 eruptions that came before it. There's also a structural detail from earlier in this sequence worth understanding, because it illustrates how unpredictable the exact outcome of a large intrusion can be. During one earlier magma intrusion event in this series, deformation signals showed magma moving in 2 directions simultaneously, both toward the northeast and, notably, southward toward Grindavik itself, a southern displacement pattern that had not been observed during other events earlier in the sequence. Officials were explicit at the time that it was not possible to determine in advance exactly where magma of this kind would ultimately surface. That uncertainty is precisely why a larger, more pressurized system heading into its next active phase draws more careful monitoring, not less, even though the pause itself might look like calm from the outside. The warning window Iceland is actually working with. One of the most important practical details in this entire story is how much notice Iceland typically gets before an eruption reaches the surface. Across the eruptions in this series, warning times between the detection of a clear magma intrusion and an eruption actually breaching the surface have ranged enormously, from as little as 20 minutes in the fastest cases to just over 4 hours in others. That is an extraordinarily narrow window by any standard, and it's the central reason Icelandic authorities have built such an extensive, continuously updated monitoring network around Svartsengi specifically: GPS, deformation stations, satellite radar imaging, and dense seismic networks all feeding into hazard assessments that get reissued every few weeks as conditions evolve. This is also why the Icelandic Meteorological Office has kept Grindavik under a standing hazard assessment for well over 2 years now, rather than declaring the town safe to fully reopen. A community sitting directly adjacent to a system capable of producing a surface eruption within 20 minutes of clear warning signs cannot responsibly return to normal occupancy while that system remains this active, regardless of how long the current pause has stretched on. What volcanologists think this means long-term. Beyond the immediate question of when the next eruption arrives, researchers studying Reykjanes have raised a bigger structural question about where this entire eruptive period is heading. Some volcanologists now suggest the current phase of heightened activity may persist not for months, but for years, potentially even decades, and that the system could be shifting toward what's known as shield volcano-type behavior, a longer-term eruptive style historically associated with sustained lower-intensity lava effusion over extended periods rather than the more episodic fissure eruptions seen so far in this cycle. If that assessment holds, the Reykjanes Peninsula would be entering a genuinely new chapter in its volcanic history, one where intermittent eruptions become a semi-permanent feature of the regional landscape for the foreseeable future, rather than a temporary resolving crisis. That reframes how both residents and Iceland's tourism industry need to think about the region, not as a location waiting to return to its pre-2221 dormancy, but as an area that has entered what researchers describe as a genuinely new volcanic era after roughly 800 years of quiet. The honest bottom line for anyone tracking this: none of what's been measured so far allows scientists to say precisely when the current pause will end. Iceland's monitoring agencies have been explicit throughout this entire series that they cannot predict the exact timing of an eruption, only track the accumulating pressure and issue hazard assessments based on the clearest available evidence. What can be said with confidence is that the system heading into its next active phase is doing so with more stored energy than at any prior point in this specific eruptive cycle, and that the mechanics of what it takes to trigger the next event appear to have genuinely shifted compared to the earlier eruptions in the series. For anyone living in or visiting the region, the practical picture has not fundamentally changed even as the underlying volcanic behavior has. Every eruption in this series so far has remained a localized fissure event that did not damage Reykjavik, disrupt Iceland's international airport, or cut off the ring road. None have caused mass casualties. The system, for all its activity, has been managed through a combination of continuous monitoring, rapid public communication, and physical protective barriers around critical infrastructure like the Svartsengi geothermal plant. That management record is exactly why Iceland remains considered a safe destination even in the middle of an active eruptive period, and there's no specific evidence suggesting the next eruption, whenever it arrives, will depart dramatically from that pattern. The genuine unknown is not whether Iceland can manage the next eruption. It's what a system carrying more stored pressure than ever before in this cycle will actually look like once it finally lets go. Final thought. Iceland's Reykjanes Peninsula spent 800 years in complete silence before waking up in 2021. And in the years since, it has demonstrated a genuinely new pattern of behavior that scientists are still working to fully understand in real time. The current pause, longer and holding more accumulated magma than any interval before it, is not evidence the system is winding down. It's evidence the system is doing something it hasn't done before in this cycle, and the researchers watching it most closely are treating that shift with the same careful, continuous attention they've applied to every stage of this eruption series so far. Whether the next event arrives in weeks or the system continues building towards something larger, the answer will come from the same monitoring network that has, so far, kept this remarkable and unprecedented chapter of Icelandic volcanism from becoming a humanitarian disaster. We'll keep tracking this closely and bring you the update the moment the Icelandic Meteorological Office reports a change. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop that comment. Have you seen this eruption cycle in person, or are you planning to? Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. See you in the next one.